Hi, it's Dustin Lanier. Thanks for listening. Please find me on LinkedIn for original public sector operations content every week. And please reach out to me if I and my team of procurement professionals at Civic Initiatives can help you be a public procurement change agent.
I was asked to speak about both how strategic sourcing functions in a public sector environment, and then also talk about how those definitions and trends fed back into the COVID-19 environment and what lessons were learned out of that. So in talking about this topic, I put forward a definition: achieving a best value outcome to a well-scoped organizational need by identifying your negotiating strengths and weaknesses through a market analysis that you can leverage in an ideally competitive contracting event. There were several aspects of COVID-19 that weren't competitive, ideally, but I'll talk about that at the end. And when talking about outsourcing, and then I also want to include a concept about tasking. How do you build a best value outcome? When we are doing strategic sourcing and it relates to outsourcing or outtasking, typically that's for services, outsourcing a function within government, groundskeeping or catering, or more complex areas that relate to case delivery. And these can be more emotional. So several factors drive a typical determination that outsourcing or outtasking would be best value. So the times that you would consider that kind of work is one, when you need access to staff to fill resources that would be outside of employee caps. In the States, many of the public sector entities have a limitation established by their governing office on how many employees that they can have at a particular time. Another one is specialized resources that would be unneeded for a long period of time. Access to intellectual capital or to a property that would be unable to develop for yourself in a time frame. If the market has developed software for a space, is the government going to create that software or replicate that software, or do we need access to intellectual property? One of the elected officials I worked for many years had talked about the yellow pages, which we don't really use the yellow pages very much, but she would always say, if I can pick up the yellow pages and find somebody that is doing that as a business, is that the mission of government? Finally, the need for deliverable accountability as a management tool. If I need to be able to know that a procurement manual that's being developed is going to be turned in a particular time frame, can I create a requirement that I only pay when I receive that, as opposed to getting that only from internal staff? So if we're working with an end user on how to define a problem well enough that it can be taken to market in a solicitation, I'll give an example of that in a second. We like to talk about goals, objectives, and methods of measure. What is the desired outcome, the objectives, the individual and measurable actions that fulfill those goals, and then methods of measure. And I would break that down further into output and outcome measures. So an output would be actions that can be measured towards an outcome. An outcome is the outcome itself. I have a picture of a riverboat here that can dredge a river. So if I were saying I need to outsource a service of being able to make a shipping lane, be able to take a certain size boat, then an output measure may be to measure the amount of silt that is removed. And an outcome measure is I need boats of a certain size to be able to go down the river. Even though the outputs may be showing progress, ultimately I can hold a vendor accountable through an outsourced action to the ultimate outcome. So when considering whether that is a solution for your particular entity, sitting with the end user to be able to go through that exercise of really understanding the goals, outputs, and methods of measure, and then doing a market analysis that says, when we look at the trends and the major players and the overall market dynamics, how would your solicitation or your tender be received? So what is the overall spend of your entity across vendors and departments? Sometimes we fractionalize our spend into individual areas. What is the maturity for the existing market for services? Does your vendor community support this kind of thing as a provided service? Are there peers that have contracted for similar services that you can learn from them, borrow some of their information? Are there enough vendors to be able to receive a competitive response? And if you continue to think through the problem about where has there been any demonstration that it can be served, how will the market receive? we can think in terms of sourcing models as opposed to simply a solicitation event that just reinforces the existing environment. I'll provide this slide later. It's talking about a problem statement style sourcing event for outsourcing and outtasking. Being able to have that goals, objectives, and definition of done. We're not telling the vendor how to deliver every service. We're saying what we would consider to be the point at which the outcome has been achieved, and then allow the vendor space to be able to say how. Conditioning factors that talk about the roles and responsibilities, what we anticipate retaining for ourselves as government in that case, what we anticipate that the vendor would do. We use a RACI, which is responsible, accountable, consulted, informed, and then the format in which we would want a response. And I realize that's a pretty deep slide, so if anyone's interested, I'll provide that later. So now, related to COVID-19, strategic sourcing is always a tool in the toolkit. With COVID-19, a lot of the traditional vendor relationships were upended. A lot of the large vendors or the large providers who had a lot of the items related to COVID-19 found themselves in a supply crunch, also had contractual requirements to provide the highest levels of government first. So there was new vendor segments that emerged, brand new vendors that had supply. At the original part of COVID-19, there was extreme pressure on procurement to both maintain their prior work and then also this entire new space around logistics and sourcing. So it was a very stressful time. It was not necessarily a time for extreme negotiation. It was more about achieving the supply chains. Some of the long-lasting flow of outcomes from that is many of the long-held anachronisms that would have limited digital transformations receded. So requirements for blue ink on contracts and a notary and a lot of things that otherwise inhibited digital transformation generally went away during COVID because people weren't there to receive the paper. And it really brought the need for a strategically enabled and appropriately focused procurement shop. We really needed a strong procurement shop. It wasn't just a purchasing function or a back office function. We needed a robust procurement organization to weather that storm and to come through the supply chain. So now that a lot of the supply chain issues have, well, certainly not been fully dealt with, but have receded as the primary, that role of procurement as a strategic enabler inside of the organization has really brought procurement to the forefront and kept them at the forefront. And so these outsourcing and outtasking and problem style solicitations that I spoke about are examples of tools in the toolkit for a strategic procurement organization. And I've talked with many procurement officers about the need to say segment by segment, category by category, what's the right sourcing model for this particular category, so that then I can place better focus on different categories that require more specific attention. So outsourcing and outtasking type work is a key part of a toolkit to be considered and employed.
Hi, it's Dustin Lanier. Thanks for listening. Please find me on LinkedIn for original public sector operations content every week. And please reach out to me if I and my team of procurement professionals at Civic Initiatives can help you be a public procurement change agent.